And so today we're going to go over what grief is, how to cope with it, and how to help someone else cope with it. And so as I give you a little bit background about myself, why don't we go ahead and launch our first poll, which is the question, what is the first loss that we typically experience as children? 1, the loss of a grandparent, 2, the loss of a pet, 3, moving, either having a friend move or we move, or 4, a house fire. And so you can go ahead and click on your screen so that you can participate in the poll. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Kayla Waldschmidt, and I am the Bereavement Coordinator at Horizon Grief Resource Center, which is a program of Horizon Home Care and Hospice in Milwaukee. So I have a master's in counseling from UW-Oshkosh, and I'm a licensed professional counselor through the state of Wisconsin. I've been a counselor for 14 years now, and I've worked and ran the Grief Resource Center here in Milwaukee for the last 11 years. And so I'm really excited that you guys are interested in the topic of grief, because I think it is something that impacts all of us on a daily and definitely yearly basis as we go through small losses and big losses. And so I'm going to go to my next screen here. Our loss experiences. I always
Kayla,
yes. Do we need a couple more seconds?
Nope, I'm ready to, they can't see your screen. So do you want me to share the results for you first?
Why don't you hold that and I'll tell you when I'm ready for them. Is that okay?
Okay. I'll just close it down so they can see your slides again.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So I always like to start my talks with the quote here. Whenever there is change, there is loss, and loss always brings about some degree of grief reaction. So often when we think about grief, we think about it occurring solely after the death of somebody in our life. However, grief happens in a variety of different places. So grief experiences occur with all sorts of different losses, from moving, fires, illness. When you have somebody in your life who has chemical dependency issues, there's many different losses that occur along that path. When we experience trauma, pet loss, job loss, relationship loss, death, and what we call disenfranchised grief. And so disenfranchised grief is the losses that are often not recognized in our society for various reasons. It can be a miscarriage. It can be when somebody is incarcerated. It can be someone who dies by suicide or homicide or an AODA overdose. A loss where we somehow feel sometimes ashamed, where we hide that loss to ourselves, or people don't often honor how significant that loss is to us. So even positive things can bring about a grief reaction for us. So for students who are graduating from college, there is a grief involved in that as well, even though they're excited about their accomplishments, excited about maybe moving on to the next program in school or moving on to a job. There is a loss of the familiar. You know, we have a routine. We know where to park. We know how the system works. We know how to operate in that system. We know everybody that we are in contact with, and having to make a change, even a positive one, brings about a whole host of new things that we have to learn and things that we're also saying goodbye to. And so why don't you give me the results of the first poll? What is the first loss that we typically experience as children?
All right, 1 second. So we had 24% of participants respond loss of a grandparent, 47% loss of a pet, 29% moving, and no one responded house fire.
Beautiful. You guys are spot on. The first loss that we typically experience as children is the loss of a pet. So very nice. So what I want you to understand today is that grief is a process. It is not an event. So if you want to go ahead and launch our second poll, the poll is, when is the worst part of the grief process? 1, when one is notified after the death, 2, between the death and the funeral, 3, 2 to 6 months after the death occurs, or 4, the whole first year after a death. Each person's grief process is going to be unique, which makes it challenging because every single member of a family, whom we would assume would all grieve the same way because they have lost the same person, is going to grieve very differently from each other based on their personality, their history with losses, and their relationship to the person who died. And so that is the single most telling indicator of how intense a person's grief is going to be, is their relationship to that person. And so that can go both ways. If we have an incredibly close connection to this person, our grief is going to be intense because it's going to be a huge shift in our lives to not have them here. On the other end of the spectrum, if we have a very challenging and difficult relationship with somebody, it can make our grief incredibly intense because maybe there's unresolved issues in that relationship, difficulties that we now have to cope with and understand without them here. I wanted to give you some models of grief to really understand what grief really looks like. And so for most of us, we have heard about the Kubler-Ross model of grief. There are some issues with the Kubler-Ross model of grief in that it makes grief look very nice, neat, and tidy, that we have a beginning and an end, and we go through these 5 stages in this order, and then we are done. However, grief is not that nice, neat, and tidy. So I wanted to give you a model of grief that really explains what grief looks like for a person. So this is the Sharon Katz model of grief. And Sharon Katz is an instructor of a grief counseling course through the American Counseling Association. And she was a grief counselor for over 30 years. And she took a look at all of the different grief models out there and devised her own based on what she was seeing from her clients. And I can say in my 14 years here doing grief counseling that I think this is spot on for people. And it's a great tool to educate people on what grief looks like so they know what to expect and know that their grief is normal. So it's a nice model for you to be aware of. So the Katz model of grief has 4 different stages: the beginning stage, the hard grief stage, the continued grief stage, and the new beginning stage. So before I launch into a description of each of those stages, why don't we get the results of poll number 2? When is the worst part of the grief process?
All right, we had 61% respond the whole first year after the death, 33% 2 to 6 months after the death, 6% responded between the death and the funeral, and no one responded when one is notified of the death.
Okay, very nice. Well, according to this model, and I think what I've seen as well, I think the whole first year can be incredibly challenging. However, I think the hardest part, the worst part of the grief process starts and occurs within 2 to 6 months after the death. And so I'll explain why. At the beginning of grief, after we find out about the loss, we enter the beginning stage where we really feel shock, denial, numbness. We can't believe that this has happened. And this stage occurs even if we know that the death is coming. So even for all of our families here at Horizon that are on hospice service, maybe for months or a year even leading up to the death and they know that it's coming, it is always a shock when the person passes away. And I think this happens for a number of reasons. You know, our brains cannot fully envision what life is going to be like without our loved one here. We do a lot of mental preparation, we do a lot of planning, but we never know what it's truly going to feel like or be like without them here, especially for those relationships like a parent where we have never known a day without them here, or a spouse where we are so intertwined with them that every moment of every day is interconnected with living with them, with facing all of our daily tasks, our planning. Our lives are just intertwined that we can't imagine that separation. And so we always have that shock. So what happens at the beginning of grief is we have what we call a head-heart split. So intellectually, we know that this person has died, but it takes a lot longer for our heart to catch up with that. And so we have a lot of periods of time where we might wake up in the morning and we think that they're still alive, and within a split second, that reality hits us, and we say, oh my gosh, they're gone. Or our muscle memory remembers all of our routines and rituals that we had with this person. And so we might expect them to call us like they did every single day, or we expect them to be home at a certain time every day. And our body gears up for that ritual to happen. And before we're even intellectually thinking about it, we have entered kind of a grief burst or an intense period of feelings about that loss as we're reminded that this person is no longer here. So the beginning stage lasts for several hours, several weeks, and it pops in and out periodically. So I met with a woman who said, you know, I had a really great day. I got a promotion at work, and I picked up the phone and I started to dial my mother's number, and it hit me halfway through that she died 10 years ago. And so we kind of come in and out of this periodically. But for her, when she got great news, the first person she wanted to call was her mom. So that muscle memory kicked in, and she had a little bit of that denial that happened until it hit her that this loss had occurred. So anywhere from 2 to 6 months after the person passes away, we enter this hard grief stage, and this is generally the worst part of the grief process. So the hard grief stage, unfortunately, occurs when at a time when all of our family and friends have gone back to their own routines, and they're not marking time in the same way. Where when you ask a grieving person when their loss occurred, they can generally tell you down to the day that it's been 49 days or 54 days since they passed away. Our family and friends are not counting that time in the same way. And unfortunately, that hard grief stage kicks in, and this is when we often need the most support. This is when all of our heavy feelings come in, intense sadness. Most of the time, people will come into the grief center and they'll say, I thought I was doing really well. I was crying periodically, but now I'm crying more than ever before. And I have more tears than I ever thought possible. This is also the point where anger can come in if it's present, guilt can show up, and generally anger and guilt start to show up at the same time. We can start to feel incredible anxiety. You know, anxiety is something we don't often talk about in terms of the grief process, but it is a huge part of it. We have that a loss of confidence in ourselves and our ability to make our own decisions, to live without this person and their advice, or to live without them having to do all the tasks that they were responsible for and having to learn everything. For example, people who lose their spouse are now responsible for writing out all of the checks, getting the yard work done, getting all the housework done. And so it requires a learning period to become adept at those skills that may have been atrophied for many, many years, or maybe they never learned because their spouse just took care of that and was on top of it. A lot of times people find an inability to make decisions, a fear of making the wrong decision. People find that they are self-focused, that they often look around the world and they say, how can the world continue to go on with my loved one gone? Doesn't everybody know what has happened? And it's hard to see people do normal things like go shopping for the holidays, even just go grocery shopping. And they walk around feeling like everybody can see their grief on them and should know that this has happened. But unfortunately, we never see what's going on inside. And so they look very normal to the outside world. And sometimes we don't often get that support then. This is often a period of time where people find they have an inability to concentrate. So when our brains get flooded with the intense emotions of grief, it tampers down a section of our brain that can focus, concentrate, that can remember things. So many times elderly people will come into the grief center and say that they are afraid they're getting the beginning of dementia or Alzheimer's. And while I always say, please go to your doctor and get evaluated and be tested to make sure, it is usually an effect of the grief process. And it will come back. But it takes a while for our brain to adjust as we work through all the chemicals of the feelings of grief. And so I often like to tell people the hard grief stage feels like you are boarding an uncontrollable fast roller coaster. It is a period of intense ups and downs, and they can change minute to minute, definitely throughout the course of the day. And so it can be very unpredictable at times, and it can be incredibly intense. As we work through the grief process and do our grief work, which we'll talk about in a moment, we move into the continued grief stage. And so the continued grief stage is similar to the hard grief stage because it has a lot of the same emotions, the same symptoms to it, but it's less intense. And so I like to tell people that throughout the hard grief stage, you need to watch out for really microscopic shifts. So I had one lady who lost her partner, and breakfast was really important to both of them. It was a time that they had an hour together every morning to eat breakfast, to talk about what their day was going to look like. And when her partner died, she said that was her most difficult part of the day. And so she gave up on even using Kleenex. She just threw a towel over her shoulder because she knew she was going to cry so much. And she would cry for an entire hour every morning. The day that she came in and she said, I only cried for 58 minutes today. That was a huge step in the grief process at the beginning because it was a small shift or change. And so these are often imperceivable. And so we need to encourage people to look for even the smallest microscopic changes in their grief process so that they know they're not going to be stuck in it forever. So what we see when we get to the continued grief stage is we see bigger and bigger shifts. So in the case of that woman, being able to only cry for 10 minutes every morning is a sign that she is really moving into that continued grief stage. And eventually, people move into having whole mornings or whole days where they don't cry, or they may not think about their loved one, which can immediately bring on a sense of guilt. And so we need to let people know that it doesn't mean that they have stopped loving their person. It doesn't mean that they will forget their person. It just means that they are seeing a sign of healing and moving forward. And then eventually, people move into the new beginning stage where they're really interested in living again, and they feel more in control, and they start investing in their new life and maybe perhaps some new interests. This is also a point in the grief process where they need to figure out how do they continue their relationship with the person that they lost. So it used to be common thought and practice that when somebody went through a death, they needed to say goodbye to that person and leave them in the past. What we found through research over many years is that what we actually need to do is find a continued bond with that person. So I like to tell people, even though your loved one is no longer physically here, you will be connected to them and have a relationship with them for the rest of your life. And that's not based on any spiritual practice. That is just based on the fact that we will never forget them and we will never stop loving them. And so people need to figure out, how am I going to carry them with me as I go forward? Maybe it is continuing their legacy in some way. Maybe it's through having a linking object that makes them feel close or connected with them. It may be continuing to wear their wedding ring, or it may be continuing to do something that they loved every year, maybe continuing a family vacation, or in one family's case, they developed a what they called Chicken Fest for their loved one's birthday every year. Chicken was his favorite food, so they all got together for a chicken dinner, and then they went to the cemetery and released the number of balloons of his age that he would have been in that year. And so it was a nice way for the family to come together every year and still honor their connection to him. Another example was, I had a gentleman whose son died, and his son liked to doodle on dollar bills. And so he took one of his son's dollar bills and put it in his wallet. And every time that he opened his wallet, he would see that, and it was a nice connection point to his son. So I wanted to talk about some normal reactions to grief. So we are affected on many different levels for the grief process. It affects our feelings. We can experience that sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety. It affects our brain functioning. It affects how we look at the world. It affects us physically. So I like to tell people, however you typically react to stress is how you are going to react to the grief process. So for many of us, that can be headaches, muscle aches, stomach aches. It can be a change in our sleeping and eating patterns. And that's on a whole wide spectrum. For some of us, when we are stressed, we stop eating and you may lose weight. I had one gentleman who, after his wife died, he lost 50 pounds. And part of that was the stress of losing his wife. And another component of that was his wife was the cook in the family. And so to not have her present, he now had to learn a whole new skill, and it was challenging for him. For other people, when they are under stress, they find comfort in food. There's a reason we call those certain things comfort food. We go to those to boost our mood a little bit. And so eating can be a way for us to cope with the emotions of grief. And the same with sleep. For many people, they find that they have a difficult time either falling asleep or staying asleep. It's not uncommon for people who've lost a spouse to tell you that they've only been sleeping in 2 or 3 hour chunks of time and are up for many, many hours in between there. And then other people find that they find comfort in sleeping because they can shut off the world and escape from the grief through sleep. It can affect us behaviorally. Many people find, especially at the beginning of grief, that they have a short temper, that they have difficulty being around their social support or large groups of people. It can affect us socially. many people find that they have kind of a lower tolerance for other people's problems. So they find that their priorities have changed, and so it's hard for them to hear people complain about their spouses when they no longer have their spouse, or to complain about their mothers or fathers because they just wish they had their parent back. And then it can affect us spiritually. Again, it's along a continuum. It can draw us closer to our religious or spiritual beliefs, or it can pull us completely away. And so why don't we launch poll 3? When does grief come to an end? 1, within a few weeks after the death. 2, 6 to 9 months after the death. 3, right after the 1-year anniversary of the death. Or 4, there is no end to grief. So as you guys are doing that, I'm going to start talking about some of the myths of grief. So there are some very common myths about grief in the United States culture that we all perpetuate. And so you may find that you hear yourself or your family speaking when you think about these myths or hear these myths, but know that we all have learned these. And so just give yourself some grace. So the first myth that we hear is be strong. You have to be strong for your kids. Or we tell people, you look so strong, you're doing so well. There takes more strength to feel our feelings and honor the grief than it does to stuff it down and just pretend that it's not there. And so we need to give people permission to express whatever needs to be expressed and let that out. We often hear, just get busy, find something to do. We tell retired people, go volunteer. We encourage people to go back to work, to get involved in something. And while there's a small grain of truth to that, in that we need to have something to do and we need to have a purpose, we can also take that too far, and we can use busy as a way to try to outrun the grief. And so what happens for people is that they can stay incredibly busy all day long, but as soon as they have a quiet moment, usually when they crawl into bed, all of those feelings and thoughts will come flooding in. And so we need to find a balance between having a purpose, but then honoring the grief and letting that out. We also encourage people to replace the loss. And so we tell people very directly, if they've lost a child, we say, well, you're young enough to have another child. Just try again. We tell people who've lost a spouse to go try Match.com to start dating. We do this most directly with pet loss, where we encourage people almost immediately to go out and get another dog or cat, go adopt. And what we often don't realize is that we can, even if we replace this role, whether it's a spouse, a child, a pet, we can never replace the person or the pet that was there. They had a unique personality, a unique role in our life that we cannot fill with another person or another pet immediately. And so we really need to be able to replace that loss if we want, after we've healed. And then we often think that there's a time limit to grief. And so I'm curious what your results were to poll 3.
All right, we had 92% respond there's no end to grief. 5% said right after the 1-year anniversary. 3% said 6 to 9 months after the death, and no one responded within a few weeks.
Very nice. I'm so glad to hear that. Absolutely. So there is no end to the grief process. So the metaphor that I like to use when working with families and clients is that at the beginning of grief, it feels like you have a 10-ton suitcase strapped to your back, and it's hard to breathe, it's hard to move, it's hard to function. And as we talk about the grief, as we allow all those feelings to come out, as we continue to share those stories and talk about them, we start to whittle that 10-ton suitcase down to a heavy suitcase and a backpack and a purse. And eventually we whittle that all the way down to a pebble that we will keep in our pocket for the rest of our life. And periodically over the course of our life, that grief will get triggered and we'll pull out that pebble and we'll feel it and we'll honor that grief. And then we'll put it back in our pocket and we'll continue forward. And so there is no time limit to grief, but we won't always feel it as intensely as we do at the beginning. There's also a myth that certain losses are not grieved. We often do this with the loss of a friend, sometimes the loss of a sibling, all of those disenfranchised losses we talked about earlier. And so we can never say that somebody will not grieve this loss without talking to them and finding out what that relationship was like for them, what this person meant to them. We also perpetuate the myth, that certain people do not grieve. And so we often discount the very young and the very old. So research has shown that even though infants can't verbalize their grief, they do feel it in their environment. And so you'll often see that they become a little bit more upset, clingy, need a little bit more reassurance. And on the same token, we often look at the very elderly and we say they've gone through so much loss in their life that they must have the coping skills and tools to deal with this, that we don't acknowledge their new losses. But they do grieve very intensely. And so we need to check in and find out how are they doing. Now, I have a 92-year-old that comes to a support group of mine, and he said after the loss of his wife that his social circle has shrunk so far. He has lost all of his family of his generation and all of his friends. And so it's a humongous challenge to be here without them. And then we perpetuate the myth that we all grieve the same, and we don't. We all grieve very individual to each other, and we need to normalize that for families as well. So when we grieve, to get that 10-ton suitcase down to a pebble, we need to do grief work. And that means allowing all of our feelings and thoughts to come forth and expressing them in some way, whether that is talking to a trusted family member or friend, going to grief counseling or a support group, getting that out through journaling or through art. We need to express it in some way. It can help to reach out to people that you trust to be able to garner that support and to engage in meaningful rituals, whether that's attending a memorial service, whether that is just honoring significant dates or times of the year that you had with your loved one and participating in those. It means coping with all of our feelings. It means crying when we're sad, talking about it, getting that support when we're sad. It means releasing our anger. So I like to tell people that anger works differently than every other emotion in our body, and that is really energy in our body. And so we need to burn that off physically. So doing something challenging like push-ups, sit-ups, running around the block, something that's going to physically exert us to burn that anger off. Dealing with the guilt. We need to talk about the guilt that we're feeling and distinguish between whether it's real guilt or false guilt. So real guilt is I did something wrong that violated my moral code and I need to make amends. But most of the time in grief, we are dealing with false guilt. And so a red flag that it's false guilt is those statements that usually begin with, if I had only known. So if I had only known they were going to die, I would not have picked a fight about the shirt that they chose to wear today. If I had only known that they were going to die, I would have said, I love you 100 more times or hugged them. If I had only known that this was going to happen, I would have made this different choice. And the problem with that is we are all only human and we don't know. And so most of the time we become a Monday morning quarterback in grief because we're looking back with all this information that we didn't have at those specific times. And if we did, we would have made a different choice or we would have done something differently, but we didn't know. And so we have to help people pop back into those moments and say, when you think about that specific day or that scenario, what did you know at that time? And I think it's always helpful for me to remember that people don't make decisions that don't make sense to them unless they have a chemical issue in their body. And so for all of us, we make the best decisions that we can with the information that we have at the time, and we need to give ourselves that grace. We need to learn how to deal with that fear and anxiety and the loneliness. And there's a big difference in grief between adjusting to living alone or being alone, which requires a lot of skills to learn, versus being lonely. And so we can, a lot of times, fill our schedules, work on expanding our social network, but there will always be that challenge of the loneliness for the person that they lost. And that is something that we can need to find the connections to that deceased person. But there will always be a piece and a part of us that will be lonely for them. We need to watch out for what we call short-term energy relievers. These are all of the behaviors that we go to when we are feeling stressed on a regular basis, and that we also use in the grief process to help us cope. For some of these, in moderation, they can be useful. The problem with these is they give us a short-term boost in our mood, which we then try to go back to over and over again. And so these can very easily turn into addictions and unhealthy coping mechanisms. So we need to watch out for when it stays healthy and when it is going to be problematic. So let's go ahead and launch our fourth poll. True or false? Grief intensifies around significant dates, anniversaries, and/or holidays. And so I'm going to continue on as you're answering that poll and talk about a little bit more about grief work. So seeing a grief counselor can be helpful. Reading about grief can be helpful. Both of those things help us normalize our grief, knowing that we are not alone. Carrying or wearing a linking object, as we talked about earlier, and then planning for those special days, such as holidays or anniversaries. And so what is the result to our poll for?
All right. Clear winner, 100% said true.
100, oh, perfect. You guys are spot on. So our grief really does intensify around those holidays, significant dates, anniversaries, or special times of the year. And so we need to help people plan for those and figure out what they're going to need to cope with those days. And so I always like to tell people, have a plan A and a plan B. So you may wake up on that day and your plan A seems infeasible. And so you need to go to your plan B. And so the one thing I tell people never to do is just stay in bed with the covers over your head. It can be very tempting to try to escape from the grief in that way, but it's usually a recipe for spiraling down into depression. So even if you don't want to acknowledge that holiday, doing something, whether it's I'm going to get up and take a shower and I'm going to go for a walk today, that is a great plan. It can also be very elaborate of I am going to follow tradition and I'm going to do everything that we used to do over the holidays. So figuring out what that specific person needs and will find helpful. We need to help people make sure that you're taking care of your health. And then journaling can be helpful. Journaling about how you feel, writing a letter to the person that you lost, writing about a special memory. Find a way to connect to that deceased person. Whenever we have incredibly intense grief, It can be helpful to talk to a qualified mental health professional, and always to reach out if one is having thoughts of suicide. So why don't we launch our fifth poll and final poll? True or false, one should never speak the name of the deceased or ask questions about them to a grieving person. And as you're taking that, I'm going to talk about how do you help somebody who's grieving. The number one thing that we can do for them is to just be with them and listen. And it seems too simple to be helpful, but that is exactly what grieving people need. So I'm wondering what the results are for our poll 5.
All right, another clear winner at that 100% said false.
Very nice. Yep. So one of the best things that we can do, as you guys obviously know, is to bond with the deceased. You want to speak their name. You want to hear their stories about them. You want to find out what makes them so important to them. You want to see the pictures, watch the videos, learn more about their life with them, and give them an opportunity to talk as much as they want about this person. And encourage them to continue to speak their name to their family and friends as well. There's a lot of pressure sometimes in that people stop speaking the person's name because they don't want to make the person cry or be upset, or they don't want to bring up bad memories or upset the holiday or whatever it is. And so sometimes we need to let the grieving person know that they need to speak that person's name first to give everybody around them the permission to continue to talk to them. It can be helpful to educate people about the grief process, what it looks like, to normalize what they're going through. The number one question I get here at the Grief Center is, am I going crazy? And so we need to let people know that these are the normal experiences and symptoms of grief. This is how long it's going to take, that there is no end. And we need to give them permission to do what they know is going to be the best thing for them. So I always tell people there are 3 things that work for everybody going through grief. 1, we need to feel it and let it out. 2, we need to take incredibly good care of ourselves. And 3, we need to follow our gut instinct about what the right decisions are for us and what is going to be healing for us, because we are the only ones who are going to know. And that means letting go of a lot of well-meaning advice from other people. We need to remind people or teach people of coping skills that are going to be healthy. We need to give them help getting practical assistance, finding somebody who's going to mow their lawn, who's going to help them figure out how to write out a check, all of those skills that they need to learn. We can help them find support through support groups, individual counseling, encouraging them to reach out to their family and friends, and then to talk to their doctors or counselors, therapists about whether medication might be helpful for them. So you guys will have these words and actions to avoid and then what to say in the notes from the webinar. But as we're going through these, as we have less than 15 minutes left today, I just want to invite you to please ask any questions that you have. And as I'm going through this, you can feel free to submit them, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can. So words and actions to avoid. Do not suggest that someone has grieved enough or that they should get over their grief and move on. We cannot prescribe for people what their grief process should look like or where they should be at a certain point in time or when it should be getting easier or better. And again, as you guys know, there is never an end to grief. And so surprisingly, people will say these things to grieving people. Oh, just get over it. Haven't you moved on by now? And so by you normalizing that for them, they know that they're not doing anything wrong or their grief is not abnormal. We often try to give people a silver lining to try to make them feel better. It's something we get taught in our culture about what friends do. You take somebody out, you distract them, you try to give them a positive spin on things. And so we say things like, it could be worse, you still have one brother, or it could be worse, I know so-and-so who lost somebody due to this method, which was far worse than what your loved one went through. However, hearing those stories or getting that silver lining, especially at the beginning, does not feel helpful. So it's very different if we come up with that on our own, but having it prescribed to us can be problematic. A lot of times, I know how you feels very supportive. However, we don't know exactly how that person feels. Our grief is different. And so open-ended questions, like, tell me how you feel, what is this like for you, is far more beneficial. I always like to tell people to avoid things like it's God's will, because that generally comes from our personal belief system. And so people can have very different reactions spiritually to a loss. So we want to find out where they are in their grief process. And so I generally like to ask people, where do you find strength, or where do you find hope? And if faith or religion or spirituality is part of that, that usually starts to come out in those questions. And then but let me tell you, we start to tell all sorts of different stories of things that we heard in the news, or stories of other losses that our family has experienced, that we try to connect or relate in that way, or make them feel better in that way. But especially at the beginning, those stories just feel hurtful. And definitely we can't prescribe people what they should do or shouldn't do or feel. So what do you say? Empathize with them. I'm sad for you. Being able to say, I don't know what to say, is a great way to start. How are you doing with all of this? What can I do? And if you're going to offer what can I do, make sure that you follow through, because most people say that but then never follow through, and that can be incredibly hurtful. I'm here and I want to listen. We often think, oh, people are going through a hard time, I'm going to leave them alone, or there's nothing that I can do to take away their pain, so I'm just not going to do anything. And listening is probably the number one thing that grieving people need. And so just being there, even if you're not talking, just your presence can be helpful. Please tell me how you're feeling, normalizing for them that it's okay to be angry with God. And I love this last one, in that you had a relationship that was meaningful and so much to be proud of. And so learning about all those stories can be helpful. So do we have any questions coming in?
We have one for now. There's still time, so please type in any questions or comments or anything you'd like to share in the chat box, please. One person asked, they have a family member whose husband recently died unexpectedly, and they were the only person there with them when he died, and kind of having the difficulty getting the image of that out of their head, trying to replace that images of happier times, when he was living. Any other suggestions for when you in that situation?
Yep, absolutely. So part of what happens is those images get kind of seared in our brains because they are traumatic. And so the reason we get stuck on them at the beginning of grief is because we are still trying to process that this has actually occurred and that they are really gone. And so one of the things that can be beneficial is to allow ourselves, when those images do come up, to feel whatever emotion is attached to them. So cry or yell or scream, talk to somebody about that image, to share it, to write it down, so that we get that physically out of our body and write it down. And so it is through processing those images that actually allows us to access the positive memories down the road, but we need to really process that, yes, this has happened, and it was traumatic for me. And so for some people, they may find, depending on the circumstances around the death and their reaction to it, that seeing a trauma counselor or a counselor that specializes in complicated grief can be incredibly helpful for them to process those images and what occurred, and their feelings around it as well.
All right, we've got another couple questions that came in.
Okay.
Is it considered grief and or a loss if your children are removed from your home? I'm assuming they mean like a child protective services removal or parental rights termination.
Yep.
Many say since they're not dead, it's not loss, so therefore you should not experience grief.
Yes, having your children removed, whether it's foster care or other circumstances, it is a loss. Even though they're still alive, it is that loss of your role as a parent in their lives on a day-to-day basis, of not having them with you 100% of the time. And so we do need to honor that grief and talk about what that's like for them to not have them around. The benefit of the fact that their children are still alive is also focusing on how do you maintain a relationship with your children. What do you need to do to connect and to let them know that you love them and that you are hopefully making those steps to also rectify the situation. But absolutely, we need to honor that feeling and also honor the other parts of those losses too. There might be some anger with the system, misplaced anger sometimes that this has happened to them and not owning their responsibility. And so it's also working on how do you process that anger and what part of that anger do I need to own to also challenge me to take action in the ways that I need to. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question is in a shelter setting, as a case manager, sometimes they have families that are experiencing grief. How do we balance supporting them through that grief, but also the expectations that we have to follow for funding and programmatic reasons? What are some suggestions or ideas on that?
Yep. So one of the best things I heard, I was at a conference given by Fred Hanna on working with adolescents, complicated adolescents, and he's had a statement that has always stuck with me. He said when he worked with teenagers, he would use the phrase, feelings are feelings, but behavior is a choice. And I think that definitely applies to the grief process as well. And so we can feel however we feel about this loss, but our behavior is always a choice, what we do with that. And so we want to make sure that, yes, we are honoring this grief, but that also means that we need to make some choices around how that is expressed, the coping skills that are used. And we also need to balance our grief with being able to function, whether that's in the shelter, at school, at work, that we need to reach out to important people to let them know when we're struggling. But also we need to follow the guidelines of this system while also balancing that out with grief. So sometimes that means, if you're in the middle of a classroom or you're at work, that you don't have the opportunity in this particular moment sometimes to let that grief out. But maybe you can set it up that you have a safe place to go to when a grief burst occurs, or you table that until you have a safe place to go to honor that grief, or know who your resources are to go talk to. But we need to let people know that, we know you're struggling, but we need to balance this out between your feeling and also how you're coping in those choices.
All right. Next question is, do you have any recommendations on what people should say when going through like a funeral line, you know, to be present and respectful, but also that quick interaction? And then a follow-up question to that, like if you see someone kind of doing some of the things you said to avoid, maybe how to address that or prevent that.
Yep. Okay. So for a lot of people, I'm sorry through a funeral line is kind of our classic response. And for a lot of people that is appropriate. Sometimes it's just, I'm thinking of you and your family, giving that hug, sharing a quick memory of that person, saying, I'm thinking about you, we're here to support you. Sometimes if you are going to actually do it, to say, you know, I'm gonna follow up with you in a couple of days and touch base so we can talk more at that time, or to say, you know, your loved one really touched my life, and I just want you to know that, something to just reassure them. And can you remind me of the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
Yes, I think it was, I'm assuming in a funeral setting, like if you see, or some sort of grieving setting, if you see someone kind of doing some of the things that you said to avoid, like, oh, I know how you feel, like ways that maybe that could be addressed appropriately or prevented.
It probably depends on your relationship with them. You know, sometimes you can educate people that you know fairly well and say, you know, I learned at a webinar or at work that this is something really good to say, and that sometimes that can be hurtful. Sometimes we just need to let people say what they're going to say if we don't have that relationship with them, or we think that it's going to offend them in some way. But I think educating those that we can to say, you know, I learned that can actually be hurtful for such and such a reason, and this is what I was taught to say, can be something that can be helpful.
All right. I think the last one, someone just asked if you could restate the statement about feelings being feelings and behavior a choice. That might be the slide.
Yep. Feelings are feelings, but behavior is a choice. Yep. Feelings are feelings, but behavior is a choice.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for your presentation and for answering your questions. I think this is very valuable information for us as we go forward working with families and individuals in our programs. Thanks to everyone for their attendance today. Again, we will send a follow-up email in the next couple of days that will have the handouts from the presenter and a link to the recording if you would like to view it again or pass it on to someone else. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.